Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. So on Friday, two cold cases from opposite sides of our state resulted in convictions and justice for survivors. Both cases were nearly 20 years old and were solved with assistance from a grant program through my office, funding forensic genealogical testing as part of our sexual assault kit initiative. These are the first cases involving these grants to reach such resolutions. On Friday, a Grays Harbor County Superior Court judge sentenced Paul Beaker to 30 years in prison for first-degree rape with deliberate cruelty for kidnapping and assaulting a 17-year-old girl in 2003. Also on Friday, Kenneth Downing pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree rape and 1 count of second-degree assault with sexual motivation for a series of home invasions and rapes in Pullman, Washington, back in 2003 and 2004. He now faces 17 to 23 years in prison. This grant program has now helped solve 3 cold cases, 1 with multiple victims. These cases are an example of what law enforcement can accomplish by working together, and importantly, a message to survivors that they are not forgotten. I'm joined today by just a great group of folks from across our state who serve every day to keep our community safe, and as you're going to learn more about today, to really stand up for survivors no matter how long a case has gone cold. So we're joined today by Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office Chief Investigations Deputy Darren Wallace, by Grays Harbor County Chief Criminal Prosecutor Jason Walker, by Pullman Police Chief Gary Jenkins, and Whitman County Chief Deputy Prosecutor Dan LeBeau. I just so appreciate all 4 of you making the trip over on short notice to join us here today for this really important conversation. I'm also joined by a few folks from my team who helped with this grant process. Assistant Attorneys General Laura Twitchell and Kate Heeman. They're from our Sexual Assault Kit Initiative team, and John Hillman, who's the head of our Criminal Justice Division here in the Office of the Attorney General. So what I'm going to do first is, before we hear from our guests, is just speak a bit about what forensic genetic genealogy is. Then I'll explain how this grant works, provide very brief background on these cases, and then you'll hear from our guests really about their important work regarding their investigations and prosecutions and what this forensic genetic genealogy can mean to solving cold case investigations across our state, and then we look forward to taking any questions that you might have. So forensic genetic genealogy involves a researcher taking DNA evidence, uploading it to a public DNA database that allows access to its data, then using that information to construct a family tree to identify potential suspects who may not themselves have a DNA profile available. To be clear, we are not talking about every person who takes a home DNA test. For example, if you just took a home test from a company like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, looked at your results, and didn't do anything else, your data is not part of the database that forensic genetic genealogists are looking at. Some people who take a home DNA test choose to take their results and upload them to a public database. Usually they're doing this in the hope of finding more relatives or historical information. People who upload their profiles consent to make this information public, and some of the databases are accessible to law enforcement. They can also opt out of having their information disclosed if they wish. There are 2 main public DNA databases law enforcement can use, GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. These DNA databases provide genealogists with information about potential relatives, which they can then use to build a family tree. For example, perhaps they get lucky and match the DNA from the cold case to a specific individual, but more likely they match the DNA to the profile of a relative. You'll hear about some examples of that. Then law enforcement looks at the individuals in the family tree to determine whether any of them are related to an existing suspect or an individual who had the means to commit the sexually motivated felony. Or if there is no suspect at all, they can investigate whether an individual identified through a match may have lived in the area at the time of the crime. These previously unknown details provide an important scientific investigative lead. That's what this is. It's a lead for investigators where the case has gone cold. So we, a number of years ago, our office sought through the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice, grants, which we've been successful in getting from large sums of money, to assist with part of our work, which is addressing the backlog of untested sexual assault kits that has been talked about in the local media now for some time. We've taken some of the funds from that grant, those grants from the Department of Justice, and directed those funds to assisting local law enforcement with forensic genetic genealogy. So to be specific, to date we've directed $120,000 to 23 cold case investigations. Those are with local law enforcement agencies all across the state, like the two that you're going to hear from today. We still have additional grant funds available to allocate to local law enforcement agencies throughout the state for this type of testing. So here's how it works for the funding we provide to local agencies. We have established contracts with all the major vendors who do this work. My office has conducted outreach with local law enforcement agencies around the state to let them know about our ability to fund this highly specialized and expensive testing. When law enforcement agencies have a cold case they think could be appropriate for forensic genetic genealogy, they can reach out to my team. We review it to make sure it meets the criteria from the Department of Justice. Again, that's where we got the grant from, was the Department of Justice, and they have specific requirements for the use of these funds. The main requirements that are relevant here is, number one, the case must be a sexually motivated violent felony, and number two, it must qualify as a cold case. So that's what these funds can be used for. For this purpose, a cold case is defined as a case where all leads have been exhausted and the DNA profile has been uploaded to CODIS, which is the National Criminal DNA Database, with no results. We then work with the Department of Justice to get formal approval to use these grant funds, get bids from our vendors, and move forward with testing. And of course, our team is available to assist as needed with local law enforcement. So briefly about first the Grays Harbor case. In June 2020, Chief Wallace, who you'll hear from brief in a moment, came to my office to seek funding for forensic genetic genealogy testing for a 2003 cold case. It's a case involving a 17-year-old McCleary girl who was abducted near her home by an unknown man. He restrained her, forced her into her car, and raped her. She and her family reported the assault to law enforcement. She underwent a sexual assault examination, and DNA was recovered. However, there were no matches in the database and no suspects. The case went cold until Chief Wallace and his team, who kept at it, reached out to our office. We funded testing through a private laboratory. Genealogists then conducted their research comparing DNA from the crime scene to public DNA databases from GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA to search for matches. They identified a relative of the suspect in the database and eventually provided Grays Harbor investigators with the names of 3 brothers who could be the suspect. One of them, Paul Beaker, lived in McCleary at the time of the crime. Law enforcement officers then worked, as you might imagine, and worked hard to gather further evidence to confirm a DNA match. Chief Wallace will share more on that in a moment. And I just want to, again, repeat how much we appreciate the hard work of these law enforcement agencies who could take a lead like this and drive that case to a conclusion. The other case you'll hear about is out of Whitman County. Back in 2003 and 2004, there were a series of home invasions and rapes in Pullman. In 2003, a man broke into a home in Pullman and threatened a woman at gunpoint. She was sexually assaulted multiple times. Then in 2004, a man broke into an apartment where 2 women were inside. The man had a gun, tied up one roommate, and raped the other. The Pullman Police Department approached my office in 2020 to seek forensic genetic genealogy funding for this case. Much like the Beaker case, the genealogist provided the Pullman Police Department with the names of a set of brothers. Pullman Police focused on Kenneth Downing because he matched the physical description from survivors' descriptions, and he worked for a construction company that did work in the area of the attacks when they occurred. Kenneth Downing's DNA matched the suspect in both attacks. On Friday, Downing pled guilty to 4 counts of rape in the first degree and 1 count of assault in the second degree with sexual motivation. He will be sentenced in Whitman County Superior Court on August 19th and faces a prison sentence of between 17 and 23 years. And so now you'll hear from the most important folks involved in this process who have led their own teams on bringing justice for survivors. And you're going to hear the order of the speakers that you'll be hearing from. We'll start with Chief Wallace to talk about his role in the Beaker case. Next, you'll hear from Chief Walker on the prosecution of that case. Then Chief Jenkins will talk about the Downing case in Whitman County and how genetic genealogy helped them to crack it. And then finally, Chief LeBeau will talk about the Downing prosecution. So Chief Wallace, we'll start with you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Chief Darren Wallace. I'm the Chief Investigator for the Grace Harbor County Sheriff's Office. And this case started, like the Attorney General said, in March of 2003, where the victim was kidnapped and taken in her car and eventually raped at a separate location. Investigators they constantly and diligently worked to try and solve this case for years and years, but eventually it went cold. Following leads, conducting search warrants, and getting DNA swabs from potential suspects. Throughout this whole case, I think we submitted 37 swabs to the state laboratory for testing, which all was negative results. During the summer 2020, I got a email from the Attorney General's office referenced this cold case sexual assault grant. I applied for it and submitted it, and the results came back to these three brothers. And the way we narrowed it down is through the victim. She did a great job, even though she was bound and blindfolded. She did a great job on describing her victim to us by referencing the victim comparison to her boyfriend. And through that description that she gave, those three brothers, we were able to focus on Paul Beaker. And as soon as we figured out started focusing on him, we started surveilling him. And then Memorial Day weekend 2020 or 2021, we followed Mr. Beaker to a Starbucks coffee shop where he bought an iced coffee, and then we followed him to Point Defiance Zoo and watched him go through the rose garden there drinking his coffee. And as soon as he discarded that cup of coffee, myself and Detective Sergeant Logan seized that coffee cup and submitted to the Washington State Crime Lab for testing. And the results came back matching Mr. Beaker to that coffee cup, was DNA to that coffee cup, which matched to the sexual assault kit to the tune of 1 in 34 quadrillion. We eventually went and arrested Mr. Beaker, booked him into the jail, and we went and notified the victim on what we did. Just to describe these, I just want to make sure the victims know we don't ever give up on these cases. And when I went and talked to her 18 years later, she grabbed my arm. I told her, he's in jail, he's in custody, we got him. And she grabbed my arm and she was just trembling, asking me, did he follow you here? So she's been living that crime every day of her life until that time period, which now, she was re-victimized going through trial. But that's how this case ended up. We arrested Mr. Beaker, and he went to trial about a month ago and was found guilty of those crimes and sentenced to 30 years on Friday. So that's that case.
Good morning. I'm Jason Walker. I'm the Chief Criminal Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for Grace Harbor County, and I wasn't actually with the office when this happened in 2003, and I wasn't with the office when the case was filed in 2010, but I knew about it because this was pretty much the only case in our office that anybody can remember that was charged by DNA warrant, and it's also sort of an unusual case for Grace Harbor. We don't have a lot of violent crime, and a stranger rape was sort of out of the ordinary. So I did know about the case, and had to be reminded when the sheriff's office called me up and announced that they had somebody in custody for it. And that's when we got involved, my office got involved in this DNA prosecution. And make no mistake, this case would have been nearly impossible to solve and to prosecute without that DNA evidence. As Chief Wallace said, they had been getting DNA samples from men around the McCleary area to the tune of over 3 dozen trying to find a suspect. And even though there were later some connections that we found out about, for example, the zip ties that were used were part of Paul Beaker's trade, the fact of the matter is zip ties are pretty common, and it probably would have gone unsolved for much longer, if not forever, without that DNA evidence. The first person to be identified and convicted by DNA evidence is Colin Pitchfork in 1987 in England. He raped and murdered two 15-year-old girls. And back then, they had to find a college professor to pretty much invent the process to extract the male DNA from the female DNA and do the matching and everything like that. And fast forward 35 years, in that case, they tested, I think, 4,000 men looking for a sample, looking for a match. And that's kind of where this case was going. Like Chief Wallace said, it was going cold. And how many people are you going to test? And then this grant from the Attorney General's office came around, and we used the genetic genealogy process and found our suspect, and resulted in a successful prosecution. But we talk about successful prosecutions and genetic genealogy. We can't get away from the impact that this case has had, and many cases like it, on the victims. Chief Wallace alluded to it a little. Well, the Beaker's arrest was about a year before trial, and during that time, during the year in between the arrest and the trial, I got to know the victim and spoke with her a lot about the impact it's had on her life. Now, we're not going to use her name because we want to respect her privacy, but she really has lived with us every day for the past 19 years, 2 months, and 28 days from the time it happened to the day that he was eventually taken into custody on a no bail hold at the end of the trial. She talked about at the sentencing, she spoke about how every time the lights go down in a movie theater, she's afraid that she's going to hear his voice. Every time she steps out of her house after dark, every time she steps out of her car, because you got to understand, getting a little more detail on the facts. Yes, this was an abduction and it was a rape, but it was also, as Attorney General Ferguson said, deliberately cruel. And actually the jury came back with a finding of deliberate cruelty because he bound her hands with zip ties, 48-inch zip ties that we later found out were part of his trade as a commercial HVAC technician. And I remember at trial when we took the zip ties out of the evidence bag and we looped the two ends that had been cut together, how small it was. The retired detective that did it couldn't even fit one of his hands through that loop. It was so tight. She described it cutting off the circulation to her hands. Duct taped her hoodie over her face, again another instrument of his trade. And she tried to fight. She tried to bargain with him, tried to talk her way out of it, and it didn't work. He was non-responsive. So he took her somewhere she didn't know, committed the rape, and then dumped her off. And just the final turn of the knife, he told her, after he was done with her, that if she told anybody, he would burn down her house and kill her father, and her entire life would be miserable, and that he would always be watching. And that's what made her afraid. So imagine her relief when she sees the handcuffs put on and he's taken away and not being able to be released. That's what it means to somebody who's had their autonomy and self-determination completely taken away from them and assaulted in the most vile way possible. So Paul Beaker was sentenced to 30 years on Friday. Coincidentally, that's the same sentence that Colin Pitchfork back in 1987 received. And it's important that we continue to have these DNA tools available to us, and the Washington state laws have made it easy. In 2000, the legislature amended the law to allow us to file these arrest warrants and informations by DNA profile. We didn't have to have a name. And then in 2006, the law was amended to enlarge the statute of limitations for these sorts of crimes. Too late for this case, but those are great help. So we need to continue to pass laws. The legislature and the courts need to continue to pass rules and laws that help us facilitate this sort of information. Because something about that old Pitchfork case is it not only helped identify the suspect, identify the perpetrator, but it actually exonerated somebody who the police already had in custody for the crime. So DNA as an evidentiary tool, it's the most tested forensic scientific method out there. DNA evidence doesn't get an identification wrong because of cross-racial identification, doesn't change its story. It helps catch the bad guys and exonerate the people who are not responsible, and that's why we need to continue to use it, and we couldn't have done that without the Attorney General's grant. So we're very thankful in Grace Harbor County. Thanks.
Morning, my name is Gary Jenkins. I'm the Pullman Police Chief. I'd also like to express my appreciation to Attorney General Ferguson and his team, because without their assistance and funding, these crimes would never have been solved. And also to the Whitman County Prosecuting Attorney's Office and Assistant Prosecuting Attorney Dan LeBeau, who you'll hear from in a minute, who worked with us the past 2 years to ensure that the case could be brought forward and that we could find justice for the survivors in this case. As Attorney General Ferguson mentioned, our cases are from 2003 and 2004. Genealogy research narrowed it down to 2 brothers in the Spokane area. We focused on one based on the suspect description provided by one of the survivors. And also some research determined that Mr. Downing was living in Spokane at the time of the crimes, and also his company that he worked for in construction was doing work in Pullman when those crimes occurred. So he was the most likely suspect. We asked for assistance from the Spokane Police Department Special Investigations Unit, who initiated a surveillance on Mr. Downing and ultimately followed him to a restaurant in Spokane where they were able to obtain some items that Mr. Downing touched, and through that DNA we received a match on Mr. Downing. Again, Spokane Police Department assisted us by locating and arresting Mr. Downing once a warrant was issued. One thing to note in our case is one of the detectives that handled the initial cases in 2003 and 2004 is still with the department and is now a commander, Jake Opgenorth, and he wanted to be the person to go and contact the survivors once the suspect was identified and arrested. And so, well, we found justice for the survivors in this case, and it's all about the survivors, but there's another element about investigators who carry this with them as well, who are very interested and compassionate about or passionate about finding justice for the survivors. And so it was very gratifying for then Detective Opgenorth to follow this all the way through to identifying a suspect, having him arrested, and then pleading guilty. So again, thank you to Attorney General Ferguson and his team and Whitman County Prosecuting Attorney. Thank you.
I'm Dan LeBeau, Chief Deputy Prosecutor for Whitman County. About 2 years ago, Sergeant Greg Umbright with the Pullman Police Department contacted me and said, "Hey, do you remember this case?" And I wasn't a lawyer or even a prosecutor at the time when the first events happened in 2003 and 2004. But I was living in the area as a student myself, and I remember the impact for every member of the community and could only imagine the impact for the survivors at the time. And it is due to the courage and the tenacity of those survivors that we are here today, because not only did they exhibit that courage throughout the sexual assaults that happened to them, but immediately afterward during the investigation, again under threat of death and with a gun and at one point a knife pointed at them, they were able to secure descriptions of the suspect, and that led to PPD investigating dozens of people just like in Grays Harbor. Commander Opgenorth actually told me, because we of course spoke as the case went along, the day they arrested Mr. Downing, he said, "I can finally take the DNA swabs out of my briefcase." He'd been carrying around with him for the last 19 years, just in case there was somebody else that he could come across and maybe get a sample from and try and get a lead on the case. But those victims, that courage and that tenacity they showed, both back during the beginning of the investigation, followed up immediately after Commander Opgenorth had notified them. Our office got in touch with them as soon as Mr. Downing was arrested, and they were immediately willing to go forward with the prosecution, willing to participate and help in any way they could. And again, to different extents, they shared their story with me as well. Two of the survivors weren't overly communicative. They were happy to participate. Well, happy is the wrong word. They were very willing to participate, happy to see the process going forward, happy to have the possibility of justice. The third survivor spoke with us on a regular basis, constantly asking questions about the legal process, trying to understand things. And that's something I'd really like to point out for any other survivor out there who's afraid of going through the process. I think the history of this, people fear that law enforcement's going to be rough, that the prosecutor's office is going to be rough, that it's going to be a cold, unjust system where they're standing up on their own at the whole time, and that is not the case anymore. Law enforcement is very understanding of people who have survived these situations. Law enforcement listens, investigates thoroughly, incredibly thoroughly, and then when the case does get to a prosecutor's office, we also work very closely with survivors so that they understand every step of the criminal process and what things are going to look like if they have to be interviewed by defense counsel, getting prepared for trial, all of those things. And that is a lot of what we spent our time working on in this case. Fortunately, we did not have to go to trial like Grays Harbor did. The Pullman Police Department put together such an incredible investigation, and I think it was probably that, along with some very diligent legal research and preparation for trial on our part, working those two things together. Mr. Downing pled guilty on Friday, and fortunately the survivors do not have to be re-traumatized by a trial in this case. The amount of people that helped us get to this point can't be overlooked either. The FBI assisted with the investigation at one point, the Spokane Police Department, Washington State Patrol's Laboratory Division, the amount of hours they worked to very quickly get us DNA results once they were able to obtain the sample from Mr. Downing led to a very quick arrest and getting him in custody where he belonged. All of these folks working together, and then with that grant from the Attorney General's office and what that allowed us to do, and working with Identifinders LLC, Texas-based company that does this forensic genetic genealogy, and the woman who did that research for us, it was amazing the amount of hours she put in order to narrow it down to these two brothers to get us to this place today. Can't be overstated. So we're very grateful to the Attorney General's office, Washington State Patrol, Pullman Police Department, who never gave up, never stopped trying. The survivors have justice today, and hopefully at this point, I spoke to one of them on Friday immediately after the hearing, and she said she'd finally be able to sleep well at night. So that's where we're at.
Thanks so much to all four of you for being here. The work, your teams, and yeah, all four of your remarks centered on the survivors, right, and their courage throughout this process, and the work of your teams, and also the work of other teams from other law enforcement agencies, federal, local as well. You know, you've heard about a 25-minute summary of these two cases that literally took years, decades to solve. And you know, I just find it, I'll just before I take your questions, it's inspiring to me that there are people out there who are trying to solve these cases, right? Especially when they go cold and just not giving up. And I think that message, right, for people to know that there are folks out there who just are not going to give up and they're going to keep at it. So it's been an honor to help in a small way with their tremendous work over all these years. So with that, we'll open up to, I know we have folks on the phone, so what we'll do is see if there's any questions here in the room. I'll do my best to remember to repeat the question so folks on the phone can hear it. And then we'll see if anyone on the phone has questions as well. So we'll open up to see if anyone in the room here has any questions at all. Go right ahead if you do. Yes. So the question is, are there plans to have more funding available for these grants? And if so, how many more cases could that help? So I'll start, but my team, feel free to jump in if you guys want to add anything to this. So there is currently still funding available from our existing grants. And I want to say $170,000. So we still have fairly significant resources available for local law enforcement who want to reach out to us in the way that these jurisdictions have. There are about close to 24 active investigations going on from local law enforcement around the state on cold cases. We obviously can't go into details about that. Those are investigations. Once they get public, then we and they can discuss it. But those are in varying stages of investigations. So to answer your question, there are still funds available, but we were talking actually earlier today. We've had more than one grant from the Department of Justice. I think we have delivered exceedingly well on those grant funds, on getting the backlog of sexual assault kits, getting those tested. And now with this portion of our grants, obviously today, you know, with the results speak for themselves. So when we feel we need to go back for more funds, we will make that request at the appropriate time. But right now there are still funds available for local law enforcement, and we look forward to them hopefully utilizing these and solving more cases. Any other questions here in the room for us? Anyone want to add to me? Did we cover that for you? Okay, great.
Yep. Chief Wallace?
Yes.
What's the status of Paul Beaker in the Lindsey Baum investigation?
So Mr. Beaker did take a polygraph last week, referenced Lindsey Baum, and he passed it. He's still a person of interest, but he's kind of lower down on the poll there since he did pass a polygraph.
Did he ever have contact with Lindsey Baum's mother?
We could never, with her mother, no. We could never get contact with Lindsay as well between him and Mr. Beaker's family.
And now that he's convicted, do you anticipate either him talking or someone else coming forward with information about the case?
I don't anticipate him talking anymore about it, but we hope he does. If he has information, or if anybody else has information reference Lindsey Baum, please come forward and let us know.
Thank you. Any other questions here in the room? If not, why don't we open up and see if there's anyone on the line who has any questions. So if you're on the line, just identify yourself, and we're happy to take a question if you're on the line.
Hi, it's Hannah Scott with Hello Radio.
Hi, Hannah. Yes, go right ahead. We can hear you.
Aside from what you've done here today in announcing the cold case conviction, what are you doing to make sure that all of the law enforcement agencies across the state are aware of this grant and the tool of genetic genealogy for their cold cases?
Sure. Thanks for that question. I think everybody heard the question here. The question just went to, hey, what's my team doing to make sure that law enforcement agencies, of which there are many across the state, large and small, are aware? So my team, as you might imagine, Hannah, has had extensive communications with individual law enforcement agencies as well as sort of the statewide organizations that essentially represent all the law enforcement agencies around the state. And so, so we believe they are aware of it, of course. But obviously, telling the story of these cases, we think hopefully helps as well, that all the law enforcement agencies out there, large and small, are aware that we still have funds, as it goes to the earlier question. And I guess the one other thing I'll just maybe repeat a bit from what I said earlier, Hannah, was law enforcement agencies are taking advantage of this grant, not just these two cases, which are, of course, so successful in reaching these resolutions. But as I think I mentioned before, we have, I think, close to 24 other local jurisdictions who have received grants from us and are doing their investigations on their cases. So the good news is it's being utilized, and we hope it continues. And now that I think in this, the grants were received a couple of years ago, I think. These two jurisdictions were really amongst the first to reach out to our office, Hannah. And so, as you might imagine, it takes time for these cases to reach a conclusion. And so I think you'll be seeing additional results from this work in the coming months and years ahead as well. Thanks for that question. Any other questions from anybody? Oh, go right ahead.
This is Gene Johnson with the AP. I was wondering, can you say how much each of the grants were for in these two cases, and is there sort of a general amount that these grants are for, or does it just depend on the case and the amount of work required?
Thanks for that question, Gene. I think I know the answer. I just want to make sure I get it right, because you also asked, hey, can the amount depend based on the case itself? So I'm just going to ask a member of my team to answer that specific question. Just go give your name.
Hi, my name is Kate Heeman. I'm an Assistant Attorney General, and the amount of a case does depend on the case. Depends on the size of the sample and the quality of the sample. On average, the cases cost around $5,400 for this type of testing.
And does that include the genetic genealogy work?
Yes, that does include the genetic genealogy.
Or is it just, okay.
It does include the genealogy work and the testing.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that question, Gene. Appreciate it. Anyone else on the phone have any questions?
It's Hannah again.
Yes,
I do
sir.
have one more for the folks in Grace Harbor County. If I could, kind of building off a previous question, if Paul Beaker is kind of lowest on the suspect list in the Lindsey Baum case, can you give some sort of update on what the status of that case is now as far as any suspects?
Exactly, yeah.
So it's still an active investigation. Mr. Beaker obviously is still a person of interest, although he passed that polygraph. So he's going to move down that list a little bit. We're still getting tips and information on Lindsey Baum. We just haven't tied it to a suspect yet. So it's still an active investigation. Although we haven't ruled out Mr. Beaker, he's down the totem pole a little bit. I just want to make that clear because a lot of people stopped sending in tips when he got arrested because they thought he was the guy. He still could be the guy. He's just lower on our list. If you have information, please keep calling our tip line and or emailing our tip line. Let us know what you have, and we can sort it out after that.
Thanks for that question. I think I heard
I have
it.
a question.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Hi, this is Drew Mickelson at King 5 News. A question for either law enforcement or prosecutors in the room. Any doubt that we wouldn't be here without this funding? I mean, would these samples just be sitting on a shelf without this help from the state?
I can address that.
Just identify yourself.
Jason Walker, Chief Criminal Deputy Prosecutor for Grace Harbor County, and as I mentioned in my remarks, I don't think that in theory this case was impossible to solve without the DNA, but it's very, 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 very unlikely that it would. The connections that we found became apparent only after we had the suspect, the zip ties, the duct tape, the fact that he lived in McCleary. A lot of people live in McCleary, and so I think that the genetic genealogy was absolutely key in obtaining a suspect and arrest, and as I said, absolutely is. I mean, I can't say he wouldn't have been convicted without the DNA. She recognized his voice. The victim recognized his voice when she first heard him speak over the internet, because our court proceedings were being broadcast over YouTube at the time because of COVID. But that's pretty weak. Just a voice. I think that the DNA was absolutely essential to the identification and prosecution of Paul Beaker.
And are those tests conducted without the funding from the state? And without that funding, are you able to take that lead?
I'll leave that to Chief Wallace.
So the funding, $5,000 out of a budget now, especially with defund the police, we kind of watch our pennies and nickels and stuff like that. So to, spend $5,000 to $8,000 to do this testing is, it's a gamble. If it doesn't pay out, then we lost that $5,000, $8,000, and that's critical to a budget, for a police force when we actually use the last $1,000 of our budget. So we probably wouldn't have done it.
So this is Dan LeBeau from the Whitman County Prosecutor's Office again, Chief Deputy. I can tell you that our case, I don't think it would have been solved without the forensic genetic genealogy. Mr. Downing did not live in the area. He had only been working there briefly at the time, back in 2003 and 2004. Without the genealogy lead, don't know how we would have ever come across him. And again, law enforcement never gave up. They were always looking for new connections, but those connections, and they're called a cold case for a reason. They went cold over the last 19 years. And they had, as part of that original investigation, they had actually interviewed various construction companies that were working in the area, because there were several large projects going on. So that was actually one of the leads that they were following up on. And it didn't pan out at the time. So I think without the genealogy research and the grant from the AG's office, Mr. Downing would still be at large, may likely never have been caught, and we wouldn't have ever been able to bring justice to the survivors and peace to the community. So that's how that would go.
Thanks for that question, Drew. Anyone else on the phone who has a question for us? If not, anyone else here in the room before we wrap up? Yep.
Could you talk about why the funding is focused specifically on sexually motivated violent felonies, and is it a possibility to open up the funding to other types of cases in the future?
So the question, just for the folks on the phone, goes to so why is the funding limited to these very specific types of cases? So that is a grant requirement from the Department of Justice. That's not a restriction that we place in the AG's office, or certainly any of our local law enforcement partners or me individually. That's from the Department of Justice. So so that is their focus with the use of these grants, and that's how we got involved and set some funds apart from our overall grant that we received, meeting that criteria. The good news is, while that is a focused criteria, as you've heard, we have a couple dozen local jurisdictions already utilizing those grant funds. So there are obviously numerous cold cases out there, and so we're just pleased that we can make this available to local law enforcement. Any final? I'm just going to invite our guests. Any final thoughts any of you have before we wrap up? If not, I'll just a final word of thanks to our guests and their teams who aren't here, and other agencies across the state who have been helpful in these cases and on the other investigations that are ongoing with the use of these grant funds. And I'll just say, as Attorney General, that I just, to me, it is It speaks volumes about these individuals and their agencies, that they just don't give up on a case, even if it's older than my kids, right? That's how old those cases are. So, so just speaking as a parent, right? If something like this happened to someone I loved, to know there are people out there who frankly give a damn and are willing to work hard and just not give up on a case, right? And just stick with it year after year. That is truly inspiring, and we're just so appreciative of your teams, the work you do, and the justice for survivors and the courage of the survivors. I appreciated the focus of all your comments on how critical a role they played in coming forward and going through a very, very challenging situation, and their identification, what they were able to do during an unimaginable situation to help law enforcement. With the grant, all these things come together to bring justice for those survivors. So thank you all for being here. We appreciate you covering this important story, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much, everybody.